The shuttle landed with a soft hiss on the docking platform of Kelos Prime, and Commander Lena Vasquez stepped out into air that smelled like copper and rain. Even though there was no sky above her, only the curved inner shell of the station world that stretched endlessly in every direction. She carried one bag over her shoulder and nothing else. A Varanthi attendant was waiting for her at the end of the platform, standing perfectly still the way their kind always did, like a statue carved from dark chitin and patience, its compound eyes reflecting her image back at her in 100 tiny fragments. "Commander Vasquez," it said, and the translator in her ear turned the clicking speech into flat, polite English. "Welcome to the Galactic Academy of Strategic Sciences. You are the first human to attend the Senior Strategic Fellowship. This is a great honor for your species." Lena smiled and said thank you, and followed the attendant through corridors that were too tall and too wide for her, built for species that stood 8 feet high and thought in patterns she had spent the last 6 years learning to read. The academy was everything the briefing files had described, and more. A sprawling complex of lecture halls and war simulation chambers, and libraries that held the combined military knowledge of 42 spacefaring civilizations, all of it organized and maintained by the Varanthi, who believed with absolute certainty that they were the most intelligent species in the known galaxy. They were not wrong about being intelligent, Lena thought as she walked, but they were very wrong about what intelligence meant. Her quarters were small by alien standards, but comfortable enough. A single room with a sweeping platform and a desk, and a window that looked out onto the interior curve of the station, where artificial sunlight painted everything in shades of gold. She set her bag down and began to unpack the bag. No hidden devices, no encrypted communicators disguised as everyday objects. The Office of Naval Intelligence had learned long ago that the best way to hide a spy was to make sure there was nothing to find. So Lena carried only clothes and books and a coffee maker that she had argued was essential to human cognitive function, which was technically not a lie. At the bottom of the bag was a notebook, leather-bound and worn soft at the edges from years of handling. She placed it in the desk drawer and closed it. She would not be opening it here. Everything in it was already committed to memory, every page, every name, every pattern. That notebook was not a tool, it was a habit, and habits were for home. The orientation briefing was held that evening in a circular hall with tiered seating that rose up like the inside of a bowl. Lena took a seat in the back row and looked down at her fellow officers. There were 12 of them in total, representing the most powerful species in the Galactic Concord, and every single one of them looked at her the way a university professor might look at a child who had wandered into a graduate seminar. The Duchon were the easiest to read. 4 of them sat together in a tight cluster, their scaled bodies radiating the quiet confidence of a species that had been fighting wars since before humanity had discovered fire. Their leader was a tall officer named Kale Vorath, and he glanced at Lena once with golden slit-pupiled eyes and then dismissed her entirely, turning back to his conversation without a word. The Awari were harder to read, but easier to like. 3 of them sat in a loose group, their smooth amphibian skin shifting colors with their emotions in ways they could not fully control. One of them, a slender male named Soreth, caught Lena's eye and offered what she recognized as a polite greeting gesture, a slow blink followed by a tilt of the head. She returned it, and his skin flushed a surprised shade of blue. The rest were a mix of species she had studied in files and dossiers for years. Varanthi analysts, a Kelani engineer, 2 Briath observers whose fungal bodies smelled faintly of cinnamon. All of them accomplished, all of them proud, and all of them united in one shared assumption. The human was here as a courtesy. Arc Instructor Quellis Vor arrived precisely on time because the Varanthi were incapable of being anything else. He was old for his kind, His chitin faded to a pale gray, but his compound eyes were sharp, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had shaped galactic military doctrine for decades. He welcomed them with a speech about the purpose of the fellowship, about how the sharing of knowledge between species strengthened the concord, about how each of them had been selected for their exceptional abilities. And when his gaze passed over Lena, it lingered for just a moment longer than necessary. Asked her to stay behind. The hall emptied, and they stood alone in the vast circular room, the arc instructor looking down at her from his full height of 8 feet, his mandibles moving in the subtle patterns that Lena knew indicated careful thought. "Commander Vasquez," he said, "I want to be honest with you. Your species is young. Your presence here is the result of a diplomatic agreement, not a selection committee. I do not say this to be cruel. I say it so that you may set appropriate expectations for yourself." "I understand," Lena said. "I would encourage you to observe and absorb," Quellis continued. "There is much to learn here, and your species would benefit greatly from exposure to established doctrines. I appreciate the advice, Arc Instructor." He studied her for a moment, and she could see the faint movements of his mandibles that meant he was trying to read her expression. Varanthi were excellent at reading other Varanthi, were still largely a mystery to them, and Lena had been trained to keep hers exactly as unreadable as she needed it to be. He dismissed her with a gesture that was polite, but final, and Lena walked back to her quarters through the tall, quiet corridors of the academy. She closed her door and sat on the edge of her bed and let out a long, slow breath. 11 years. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Concord for 11 years, and in that time they had smiled and nodded and said thank you and signed treaties and traded technology and attended cultural exchanges and done every single thing that a young and humble species was supposed to do. And in that same time, the Office of Naval Intelligence had mapped every communication network in the Concord, identified the classified operational doctrines of 9 major species, penetrated the personal files of over 200 senior military officers, and built a threat assessment database so detailed that it made the Voranthi's own intelligence archives look like a children's encyclopedia. Nobody knew, nobody even suspected, because the galaxy looked at humanity and saw exactly what humanity wanted them to see: a young species, a little clumsy, a little eager, grateful to be at the table. Lena looked out her window at the golden light of the station world and thought about the encrypted briefing she had memorized before leaving Earth, the one that ended with 4 words that still sat heavy in her chest: "Something is coming. Be ready." The next morning she walked into her first lecture, a seminar on predictive dominance theory taught by the legendary Duchon strategist, Professor Drune Keller. She took her seat in the back row and folded her hands in her lap. She did not bring a notebook. She did not activate a tablet. She simply sat and listened with the calm, patient expression of someone who had read the classified source material for this lecture 3 years ago. Varanthi fellow in the row ahead glanced back at her empty desk and then turned away with a look that was unmistakably contemptuous. Lena did not mind. Contempt was useful. It meant they were not paying attention to her. And that was exactly where she needed them to be. 3 weeks passed at the academy, and Lena Vasquez became invisible. Not literally, of course. The other fellows could see her just fine. She was there every morning in the back row of every lecture. She was there in every seminar. She was there in the war simulation chambers when they ran their exercises. But she had become the kind of invisible that happens when people decide you do not matter. The kind where they stop noticing you, even when you are sitting right in front of them. And that was fine with Lena, because invisible people see everything. The pattern she established was simple and consistent. She arrived on time, she sat in the same seat, she listened carefully, and she never once took a note. Not on a tablet, not on a holographic display, not on paper, nothing. Her desk remained empty, while every other fellow filled screens and pages with dense observations and analysis. The Varanthi fellows wrote with mechanical precision, tapping out structured outlines, that organized every concept into nested hierarchies. The Duchon recorded everything with the aggressive thoroughness of warriors who treated knowledge like ammunition. The HFY took notes in flowing emotional shorthand that captured not just the content, but the feeling behind it. Lena sat with her hands folded, or her chin resting on her fist, and sometimes her eyes were half closed, and if you did not know what you were looking at, you might think she was bored, or tired, or simply not smart enough to keep up. Sorath, the HFY, was the first to approach her about it. He found her in the dining hall one evening, sitting alone, with a cup of the dark bitter liquid that humans seemed to need the way other species needed water. "Commander Vasquez," he said, sliding into the seat across from her, his skin shifting to the soft green that meant he was being deliberately gentle. "May I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Have noticed that you do not take notes in any of our sessions. Do you not find the material challenging enough to warrant notation?" Lena looked at him over the rim of her cup and smiled in a way that made his skin flicker briefly to confused yellow. "I find it very educational," she said. Sorath waited for more, but more did not come, and after a moment he nodded politely and left, his skin still tinged with that uncertain yellow. The war simulation exercises were where things got interesting. The fellows were divided into teams of 4 for a strategic scenario, the defense of a colony system called Veraf 7 against a superior raiding force. Lena was assigned to a team led by Kale Vorath, the Duchon officer who had dismissed her on the first day, and had not spoken a single word to her since. Kale looked at his team assignments, saw her name, and made a sound deep in his throat that the translator rendered displeasure. "Inwara Vasquez," he said, "you will handle logistics observation, monitor supply lines, and report anything unusual. Do not interfere with tactical decisions." "Understood," Lena said. The simulation began, and Kale did exactly what Duchon officers always did. He attacked. His fleet surged forward in an aggressive wedge formation designed to overwhelm the enemy vanguard with concentrated firepower. It was textbook Duchon doctrine, bold and violent and utterly predictable. NP. The opposing team, led by a Varanthi analyst named Theric, had clearly studied Duchon methods. They feinted a retreat, drew Kale's fleet forward, and then struck at his now exposed supply lines with a secondary force that had been hiding in the gravity shadow of the system's gas giant. Kale's fleet was cut off, outmaneuvered, and slowly strangled over the next 2 hours of simulated combat. He fought brilliantly with what he had, Lena would give him that, decided the moment he committed to the forward push. In the debrief, Professor Keller stood at the front of the room and looked at the gathered fellows with the quiet disappointment of a teacher who had seen this mistake 1,000 times. "The defense failed," he said, his deep Duchon voice rumbling through the translator. "Who can identify why?" Silence. The Varanthi fellows looked at their notes. The Duchon looked at the table. The HFY shifted uncomfortably. Lena raised her hand. Keller's heavy brow ridges lifted slightly. This was the first time the human had volunteered anything in 3 weeks. "Commander Vasquez," he said. "The defense failed because Commander Vorath followed standard Duchon Engagement Protocol 7, Lena said, her voice calm and even, which prioritizes rapid force projection and assumes that offensive momentum will compensate for logistical vulnerability. But Protocol 7 was developed for engagements where the enemy's strategic disposition is known. In this scenario, the enemy disposition was unknown, which means the protocol's core assumption was invalid from the start." The room was quiet. "The deeper problem," Lena continued, "is not the protocol itself. It is the doctrinal assumption behind it. Duchon military theory treats defense as a temporary state that exists only to enable a faster attack. This means that defensive logistics are consistently undervalued in planning. Not because Duchon officers are careless, but because the doctrine itself treats supply line security as a secondary concern. The enemy team did not outfight Commander Vorath. They simply attacked the one thing his doctrine told him not to worry about. The silence lasted for 5 full seconds, which in a room full of military officers felt like an eternity. Keller stared at her with an expression she could not fully read. Duchon faces were built for intimidation, not subtlety. Something behind those golden eyes that might have been surprise. "Where did you study fleet doctrine, Commander Vasquez?" he asked. "I read a lot," Lena said. After the session, Kale Vorath followed her into the corridor. He moved fast for someone his size, and he stepped in front of her, blocking the hallway with his broad-scaled body. Not threatening exactly, but not threatening either. "That flaw you identified," he said, and his voice was lower than usual, the way Duchon voices got when they were being serious. "That specific weakness in Protocol 7, that has never been identified by a non-Duchon. Our own internal reviews have raised it, but those reviews are classified." Lena looked up at him. He was nearly 7 feet tall, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Maybe no one was looking from the outside," she said. Kale studied her for a long moment, and then stepped aside. She walked past him, and did not look back. She could feel his eyes on her, all the way down the corridor. 2 days later came the lecture that changed everything. Arc Instructor Quellis Vor was teaching a session on signals intelligence and communications interception, specifically the Voronthi methods of cryptographic analysis that were considered the gold standard of the entire Concord. Every intelligence agency in known space used Voronthi encryption principles, and Quellis had literally written the foundational text on the subject. He was midway through explaining the theoretical framework behind layered cipher construction, when he paused and looked up at the back row. Lena was sitting in her usual position, hands folded, no tablet, no notes, eyes steady. Quellis clicked his mandibles once, a sharp sound that cut through the quiet hum of the lecture hall. "Commander Vasquez," he said, and every head in the room turned. "I have observed that you never take notes in any session at this academy. Do you believe yourself to be above the material being presented?" A few of the Voronthi fellows exchanged glances. Kale watched from his seat with narrowed eyes. Sorith's skin went pale with discomfort. Lena looked at the Arc Instructor calmly. She did not shift in her seat. She did not look away. She did not smile. "No, Arc Instructor," she said. "I do not take notes because you are teaching my intelligence reports." The room went absolutely still. Quellis's mandibles froze mid-click. A Voronthi expression that Lena knew meant his brain was trying to process something that did not fit any expected pattern. "Explain," he said. Lena stood up. She did not rush. She placed her hands behind her back, the way she did when she was delivering a briefing, and she began to speak. She did not recite the lecture. She recited what was behind the lecture. She named the classified Voronthi operational report from which the cipher methodology had been derived. She named the specific fleet engagement during the Kelos border conflict, where it had first been field tested. She named the Voronthi intelligence officer who had originally developed the framework, an officer whose identity was supposedly buried under the highest classification the Voronthi government maintained. She recited these facts the way someone might recite a grocery list, without drama, without pride, simply and clearly. "Your lecture is excellent, Arch Instructor," she said when she was finished. "But I briefed a version of this material to my own command staff 3 years ago. I am here to see if there's anything we missed." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the station's environmental systems. Quellis Vor stood at his podium and looked at the human woman in the back row, and for the first time in his very long career, he did not know what to say. "Class is dismissed," he said quietly. Filed out in stunned silence. Kale passed Lena's row and paused for just a moment, long enough to look at her, with an expression that was no longer contempt or curiosity, but something much more dangerous. It was respect. When the room was empty, Quellis stood alone behind his podium, his mandibles clicking in the rapid pattern that meant a Voronthi mind was working at maximum speed. Then he opened a secure channel to Voronthi Central Intelligence and said 4 words that would set off a chain reaction across the entire Concord. The Academy changed overnight, not in any way that a visitor would notice. The lectures continued, the corridors stayed clean and quiet, the artificial sunlight still painted everything gold. But underneath the surface, the atmosphere had shifted the way air shifts before a storm, charged and heavy and waiting. Lena felt it in the way people looked at her now. The Voronthi fellows no longer ignored her. They watched her with the careful stillness of prey animals who had just realized that the creature they thought was harmless had teeth. The Duchon officers studied her with new intensity, their golden eyes tracking her movements through the halls like predators reassessing a rival. Even the Owari, gentle and empathic as they were, kept a careful distance, their skin colors muted and guarded. Soreth was the exception. He still sat near her in the dining hall, but now his questions were different. "You frightened them," he said on the second morning after the lecture, his skin a troubled shade of gray. "Not with violence or threats, but with the idea that they have been seen without knowing they were being watched. For a Voronthi, that is the deepest kind of violation." "I know," Lena said. "You did it on purpose." "Yes." Soreth's skin flickered through several colors too fast for Lena to read, then settled on a deep, steady blue that she had learned meant an Owari was making a decision. "Why?" he asked. Lena took a sip of her coffee and looked at him over the rim, and for just a moment she let him see past the mask. Soreth was an empath. He could feel the emotional states of others, the way humans could feel heat or cold. And what he felt from Lena in that unguarded moment made his skin go white. Fear, deep and old and carefully controlled. The kind of fear that lived in the bones of someone who had been carrying a terrible weight for a very long time. "Because something is coming," Lena said, "and they need to be ready." Before Soreth could respond, a Voronthi attendant appeared and informed Lena that Archinstructor Quellis Vor requested her presence in his private study immediately. The Archinstructor's study was a circular room at the top of the Academy's central tower, its walls lined with data crystals that held centuries of Voronthi strategic thought. Quellis stood behind a desk made of polished dark stone, and he was not alone. 2 other Voronthi were present, both wearing the subtle markings that Lena recognized as Voronthi Central Intelligence. They did not introduce themselves, which told her everything she needed to know about how seriously they were taking this. "Commander Vasquez," Quellis said, and his voice was carefully controlled in a way that it had not been before. He was not condescending now, he was precise, which for a Voronthi meant he was operating at maximum caution. "I will be direct. How much does Terran intelligence know about Voronthi cryptographic operations?" Lena looked at the 3 Voronthi and made a calculation that took less than 2 seconds. She had prepared for this moment for months. She had rehearsed the words, calibrated the tone, planned exactly how much to reveal, and in what order. "Enough to know that your Cipher 9 protocol has a recursive vulnerability in its 3rd layer encoding," she said. "We identified it 4 years ago. We chose not to exploit it." She paused just long enough for that to land. "You are welcome," she added. One of the intelligence officers made a sound like cracking glass, which Lena knew was the Voronthi equivalent of a gasp. Quellis's mandibles went completely still, which was worse than clicking. It meant his emotional processing had overloaded. "That is not possible," the second intelligence officer said. "Cipher 9 is our most secure protocol. It has never been breached." "It has not been breached," Lena agreed. "I said we identified a vulnerability. I did not say we used it. There is a difference, and that difference is the reason I am telling you now. Quellis raised one chitinous hand to silence his colleagues, his compound eyes fixed on Lena with an intensity that she could feel like physical pressure. Why, he asked, why would you reveal a strategic advantage? Lena had been waiting for this question. It was the door she needed to open. Because the people who are coming will not be as polite as we are, she said, and you need to fix it before they get here. The room went very quiet. Explain, Quellis said. Lena did not sit down. She stood in the center of the room and spoke the way she spoke in briefings back on Earth, clear and measured and without a single wasted word. Terran intelligence, she told them, had detected patterns in deep space signals originating from beyond the Concorde's mapped borders. The patterns were faint and irregular and buried in background radiation in a way that suggested deliberate concealment. They had been present for at least 15 years, possibly longer, and they were consistent with long-range reconnaissance conducted by a technologically advanced civilization. No other species in the Concorde had detected them. Quellis asked the obvious question. How could humans detect what Varanthi sensors, the most sophisticated in the galaxy, could not? Lena almost smiled. We do not have the best sensors, she said. We do not have the best algorithms. What we have is paranoia. My species spent its entire history before spaceflight spying on itself. We fought wars over secrets. We built entire government agencies devoted to the assumption that someone somewhere was always watching us. We did not develop intelligence gathering as a science. We developed it as a survival instinct. We see threats in patterns because we evolved expecting betrayal. She let that settle for a. Your sensors are better than ours, she continued. Your mathematics are more advanced. Your processing power is superior in every measurable way. But you built your detection systems to look for things you expected to find. We built ours to look for things that someone was trying to hide. That is not a technological advantage, it is a psychological one. The intelligence officers exchanged a look that Lena could not read, but Quellis never took his eyes off her. You said someone is coming, he said. Who? We do not know yet, Lena said, but we know they are patient, we know they are methodical, and we know they have been watching the Concorde for a very long time. The meeting ended without resolution. Quellis dismissed her with a courtesy that bordered on deference, and Lena walked back through the corridors, knowing that the Varanthi intelligence officers were already sending encrypted messages to their homeworld. That afternoon, Kale Vorath was waiting outside her quarters. He was leaning against the wall with his massive arms crossed, his tail curled around his feet, and his expression was the kind of controlled stillness that Lena had learned meant a Druushan was experiencing something they did not have a word for. I reviewed the internal after-action reports for the Vareth Corridor campaign, he said without greeting. The classified ones, the ones that only Druushan High Command is supposed to have access to. Lena waited. Every flaw you identified in the simulation corresponds to a criticism raised in those reports, he said. Not approximately, not in the general sense. Exactly. You did not just read our doctrine, you read our classified self-assessments. Yes, Lena said, because there was no point in denying it. Kale's jaw tightened. The scales along his neck ridge shifted color slightly, a Druushan stress response that most non-Druushan never learned to recognize. Has humanity been watching us? He asked. Lena looked up at him. 7 feet of muscle and scale and predatory instinct, a warrior from a species that had been conquering worlds since humanity was still figuring out bronze. Kale, she said, we have been in the Concorde for 11 years. We started watching you in year 1. What do you think we have been doing with the other 10? He stared at her for a long time, and she could see something shifting behind his eyes, something that looked like the ground moving under a building, the slow, terrible realization that the foundation you trusted was not as solid as you thought. Why are you telling me this? He said. Because I need you to understand something, Lena said. We did not watch you because we are your enemies. We watched you because we needed to know if you could survive what is coming. All of you, the Varanthi, the Ilwari, the Duchon, every species in the Concord. Lena paused, and for just a moment, Kale saw something in her face that he did not expect. It was not arrogance or triumph, or the cold satisfaction of a spy revealing her advantage. It was worry, real, and deep, and human. I concluded that you are all very good at what you do, she said, and that none of you are good enough alone. That evening, Lena sat in her quarters with the lights dimmed and her coffee growing cold on the desk. She was staring at nothing, running through scenarios in her head the way she had been trained to do, mapping possibilities and outcomes and threat vectors. Her communicator chimed, a single pulse that meant an encrypted burst transmission from Terran Ani, routed through 7 relay stations and disguised as routine navigational data. She opened it and read the contents. The color drained from her face. The message was short, just a string of code phrases that she had memorized years ago, but each one carried the weight of years of intelligence work and billions of lives. The deep space signal patterns had changed. They were no longer consistent with reconnaissance. They were consistent with staging, pre-positioning, the kind of activity that a military force engages in when it is done watching and is preparing to move. Lena closed the message and sat in the dark for a long time. They are ahead of schedule, she whispered to the empty room. And somewhere out beyond the edge of mapped space, in the cold black distance between stars, something vast and patient and very old was turning its attention toward the light. Lena did not sleep that night. She sat at her desk with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes closed, and she breathed slowly and deliberately, the way they had taught her in training. The way you breathe when your body wants to panic, but your mission requires you to think. By morning she had a plan. She went to Quellis first, because the Voranthi controlled the academy, and nothing happened on Kelos Prime without their permission. She stood in his study, and told him she needed an emergency assembly of the full fellowship and the senior faculty. Sealed room, no recording devices, highest classification. Quellis studied her for a long moment, his mandibles moving in the slow, deliberate pattern that meant a Voranthi was weighing consequences. What has changed? He asked. The timeline, Lena said. Everything I warned you about is happening faster than we projected. Quellis could have refused. He could have demanded more information first, have routed the request through Voranthi bureaucracy and buried it in procedure. But something in Lena's voice, or perhaps something in the careful, controlled stillness of her body, told him that this was not a moment for caution. He granted the assembly. Lena went to Kale next, because she needed the Duchon, not their military strength, but their credibility. When a Duchon warrior said something was a threat, other species listened. She found him in the combat training hall, where he spent his mornings, and she told him what she needed. You want me to stand with you, Kale said, his golden eyes narrowing. I want you to stand with the truth, Lena said. I know what I have is real, but they will not believe a human, not yet. They need to hear a Duchon say that the threat is worth taking seriously. I have not seen your evidence. You will, in the assembly, and when you do, you will know I am right. I am asking you to trust me for the next 3. Kale looked at her for a long time, and then he did something that surprised them both. He nodded. She went to Soreth last, because she needed him most of all. Not for his diplomatic skills, but for his empathy. The other fellows would be afraid and angry and defensive when they heard what she had to say. And afraid, angry, defensive people made bad decisions. Soreth could read the emotional temperature of the room and help her navigate it. You are going to tell them everything, Soreth said, his skin a deep, troubled purple. Yes, she answered. They will not want to hear it, he said. I know, she replied. Lena, and it was the first time he had used her first name, What you are feeling right now, I can feel it from here. It is not just concern. It is grief. You are grieving something that has not happened yet. Lena looked at him, and for just a moment, her mask slipped completely. I am grieving the time we have already lost, she said. The sealed chamber was deep in the Academy's core, a room designed for the most classified discussions in the Concord, walls lined with signal-dampening material, no network connections, no recording capability, the kind of room where secrets went to be spoken aloud, and nowhere else. The 12 fellows sat in a semicircle, facing a central platform. Behind them sat the senior faculty, Quellis and Keller, and half a dozen others. The air was thick with tension, and the faint chemical scent that Varanthi produced when they were anxious. Lena stood on the platform alone, and she began. She told them about the Sci-Fi Dominion. She spoke for 20 minutes without stopping, laying out what Terran intelligence had spent nearly a decade assembling, a picture of a civilization that existed beyond the Concord's mapped borders, vast and old and patient in a way that none of the known species had ever encountered. The Sci-Fi did not conquer through force, not at first. Knowledge. They watched, and they learned, and they manipulated. And they had been doing it to the Concord for at least 30 years. The room was skeptical. She could see it in the rigid posture of the Varanthi, the restless shifting of the Duchon, the pale, uncertain colors of the Ilwari. They did not want to believe her, and she did not blame them, because what she was telling them meant that everything they thought they knew about their own security was wrong. So she stopped talking about human intelligence and started showing them their own. She pulled up Varanthi communications logs from the past decade and highlighted anomalies that their own analysts had flagged and then dismissed as background noise. She showed them the pattern, not random interference, but structured signals buried so deep in the noise floor that you would only find them if you were looking for something hidden. She turned to the Duchon and pulled up records of border engagements along the rimward frontier, small skirmishes that Duchon High Command had attributed to pirates or local insurgents. She showed them the tactical patterns in those engagements, patterns that were too coordinated and too well informed to be the work of random raiders. Someone had been testing Duchon response times and force deployment protocols, probing for weaknesses the way a doctor probes for a wound. She turned to the Ilwari and showed them something that made Soret's skin go completely white. A timeline of diplomatic negotiations over the past 15 years, in which the Ilwari had been subtly guided away from forming an alliance with a neutral species called the Verith, an alliance that would have closed a strategic gap in the Concord's rimward defense. The manipulation was so delicate, so perfectly calibrated to Ilwari psychology, that no one had ever suspected it was manipulation at all. The Sci-Fi had not just spied on the Concord, they had shaped it. They had kept the species divided, each proud of their own methods, each suspicious of the others, each blind to the pieces of the puzzle that only their neighbors could see. The room was no longer skeptical, it was afraid. A Varanthi military analyst named Theric, the same one who had led the opposing team in the war simulation, stood up and asked the question that everyone was thinking. If the Sci-Fi have been manipulating the Concord for 30 years, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, why did they not manipulate the humans? Lena looked at him, and the room went very still. They tried, she said. In our second year in the Concord, we detected an infiltration attempt in our diplomatic corps. A Sci-Fi agent operating under deep cover, using a forged identity from a neutral trading species. The agent was good. Better than anything we had encountered before. She paused. We did not announce it. We did not file a protest. We did not alert the Concord. We simply followed the thread, and we kept pulling. For 9 years we pulled on that thread, and it led us through a network of intelligence operations spanning the entire Concord. It led us to the anomalies in Veranthi communications. It led us to the pattern in Druashan border skirmishes. It led us to the manipulation of Ilwari diplomacy. She looked around the room at the faces of 12 species who were only now beginning to understand what they were dealing with. "That thread led us here," she said. "To this room, to this moment." The room erupted, voices overlapping in half a dozen languages, translators struggling to keep up, accusations and denials and questions all crashing together like waves. A Druashan officer slammed his fist on the table. A Veranthi analyst began rapidly clicking through data on a hidden terminal. An Ilwari diplomat's skin was cycling through colors so fast it was almost strobing. Quellis silenced them, not with a word, but with a gesture of calm authority. "Shout!" But with a single sharp click of his mandibles that carried the authority of decades, the room went quiet, and he turned to Lena with compound eyes that held something she had never seen in a Veranthi before. "Humility." "What do you recommend, Commander Vasquez?" he asked. Lena looked at him, and then at the rest of them, 12 officers from 12 species, each one brilliant in their own way, each one blind in their own way. "Stop teaching your intelligence doctrines in classrooms," she said. "Start sharing them in war rooms. Every species in this room has a piece of the puzzle. The Veranthi have the best signals analysis. The Duchon have the best tactical assessment. The Ilwari have empathic capabilities that no technology can replicate. Alone you are all blind in different ways. Together you might be as paranoid as we are." She let that last word hang in the air. "And right now," she said quietly, "that is what you need to be." Lasted another 4 hours. By the end of it, the fellowship had been transformed from an academic program into something that had never existed before in the history of the Galactic Concord. A joint multi-species intelligence cell with the authority to share classified information across every security boundary that had kept them apart. It was messy and uncomfortable, and every officer in the room hated at least part of it. But they did it, because the alternative was worse. That night, as Lena walked back to her quarters, her communicator pulsed again. Not an encrypted Ani transmission this time, but an open Concord alert. A deep space sensor array on the rimward border had gone dark. Signal lost. Cause unknown. 20 minutes later, a second array went silent. Then a third. Lena stood in the corridor of the academy and felt the weight of what was coming settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Heavy and cold and real. Done watching. They were coming. And the only advantage the Concord had was 11 years of human paranoia and a room full of officers who had just learned the hardest lesson humanity had to teach. Trust is a luxury. Verify everything, and never ever assume that the silence between the stars is empty. The first 6 hours were chaos. Across the Concord, species did exactly what decades of separate doctrine had trained them to do. The Druchon mobilized their fleets and pushed them forward toward the rimward border in massive aggressive formations. The Veranthi pulled their assets back behind layered encryption networks and began sealing their communications infrastructure. The Ilwari opened diplomatic channels toward the dark space beyond the border, broadcasting greetings and offers of peaceful contact into a void that swallowed their words without reply. Every response was predictable. Every response was wrong. And every response was exactly what the Sathari had spent 30 years preparing for. Lena watched the strategic feeds in the Academy's newly repurposed command center and felt a sick, familiar weight in her stomach. The weight of watching intelligent, capable people walk into a trap because they could not imagine that someone had already mapped the inside of their minds. But there was one thing the Sathari had not mapped, one variable they had not accounted for, because it had not existed until 3 days ago. 12 officers from 12 species sitting in a room together, sharing everything, hiding nothing, thinking not as Varanthi or Duchon or Ilwari or human, but as something new, something that had no name yet. Lena did not take command. She did not have the authority, and she did not need it. What she did was something more subtle, and in many ways more powerful. She asked questions. She turned to the Varanthi analysts and said, "Your encryption networks are your first instinct. You are sealing yourselves inside a fortress. But what if the fortress is exactly where they want you? What would you see if you stopped trusting your own walls and started looking at what is trying to get in?" She turned to Kale Vorath and the Duchon officers and said, "Your fleets are surging forward, because that is what Duchon fleets do. But what if the enemy wants you to attack first? What if every engagement along the border for the last decade was designed to teach them exactly how you fight, so they could build the perfect counter?" She turned to Soreth and the Ilwari and said, "You are reaching out with open hands, because that is who you are. But what if the diplomatic channel is not a bridge? What if it is a weapon? What if they are using your empathy to map your emotional responses so they can predict your decisions?" The questions landed like stones dropped into still water, and the ripples spread. Thirek, the Varanthi analyst, was the first to move. He pulled up the Concord's communications network, and instead of reinforcing the encryption, he began analyzing the traffic patterns from the outside, not looking at what was being protected, but at what was probing the defenses. Within an hour, he had identified 17 distinct intrusion signatures that did not match any node. Species in the Concord's database. The Scythari were already inside their networks, not breaking the encryption, but riding alongside it, hiding in the gaps between data packets like parasites in a bloodstream. "They are not trying to break in," Thirek said, his mandibles clicking with rapid agitation. "They are already in. They have been in for years. They are not reading our messages. They are reading our patterns. They know how we think, because they have been watching us think." Kale was next. He stood over the tactical display showing Duchon fleet movements, and for the first time in his life, he did something that went against every instinct his species had bred into him for 10,000 years. He ordered a retreat. Not a full retreat, a selective one. He pulled the forward fleets back to secondary positions and left behind a screen of lightships broadcasting the electronic signatures of a full battle group. It was a deception, a false front, operation that Duchon doctrine had never contemplated, because Duchon doctrine considered deception a lesser species tool. "If they know how we fight," Kale said, his voice rough with the effort of fighting his own nature, "then we must fight in a way they do not know, the human way. Let them see what we want them to see." Soreth's contribution was the most unexpected of all. He closed the diplomatic channels, every single one, and then he did something that no Ilwari had ever done in the history of their species. He turned his empathic abilities inward, toward the Concord's own communications network, not listening for alien emotions, but for familiar ones, the emotional signatures of Concord officers and diplomats and analysts. And he found them, anomalies, subtle wrongnesses in the emotional patterns of certain communications, messages that said the right words, but carried the wrong feelings, like a song played in the right notes, but the wrong key. Scythari compromised channels, puppet strings so fine that no technology could have detected them, but an Ilwari empath listening with human suspicion could feel them like splinters under the skin. 14 channels, Soreth said, his skin a shade of white that Lena had never seen before. 14 of our own communication lines are being fed false information. They are not just watching us, they are whispering to us, telling us what they want us to believe. One by one the pieces came together, not through any single species genius, but through the combination of all of them. Varanthi analysis, Duchon tactical instinct, Ilwari empathy, and underneath it all, the one thing that humanity had contributed to the galaxy, the bone-deep suspicion that someone was always lying. Quellis Vor cracked the Sathari's own communication encryption at 4 in the morning. He had been working for 16 hours straight, his old chitin dull with exhaustion. Mathematical superiority, which had failed, but by applying a principle that Lena had said to him in a conversation that felt like a lifetime ago. Do not look for the pattern, she had told him. Look for where someone is hiding a pattern. He found it, a layer of structured data buried inside what appeared to be random cosmic radiation, so perfectly camouflaged that no algorithm designed to find patterns would ever have detected it, because it was specifically designed to not look like a pattern. You could only find it by looking for the absence of a pattern in a place where there should have been one. The Sathari vanguard had been coordinating through this hidden channel, and now the Concord could hear them. The battle, when it came, was nothing like what either side had expected. The Sathari vanguard dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Verat system, expecting to find exactly what 30 years of manipulation had prepared for them. Duchon fleets overextended in aggressive formations. Varanthi networks sealed and blind to infiltration. Ilwari diplomatic channels open and vulnerable. Instead, they found empty space, where the Duchon fleet should have been, compromised channels that had been quietly fed false data for the past 12 hours, and a Concord force positioned not where doctrine said it should be, but where human paranoia said the enemy would least expect it. Kael Vorath led the engagement, and he fought like nothing the galaxy had ever seen. Not like a Duchon, not like a human, but like something new. Aggressive when the enemy expected caution, and cautious when the enemy expected aggression. Every move designed not to win through strength, but to confuse and disorient an opponent that had spent decades learning to predict him. The Sathari vanguard was broken in 9 hours, not destroyed. They were too numerous and too well equipped for that, but broken, their coordination shattered. Their carefully constructed predictions proven wrong at every turn. They retreated into dark space in disorder, leaving behind wreckage and silence, and the first Concord victory in a war that no one had known was being fought. In the aftermath, the fellows gathered in the lecture hall where it had all begun. They were exhausted. Kael had a bandage on his arm where a console had exploded during the battle. Thirek's mandibles were chipped from stress clicking. Soreth's skin was so washed out that he looked almost translucent. Lena had dark circles under her eyes, and her hands were shaking slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep. But they were alive, and they were together, and that meant something that none of them fully understood yet. Quellis Vor stood at the podium, where weeks ago he had taught cryptographic theory to a room full of officers who thought they knew everything. He looked out at them, and then he looked at Lena, sitting in the back row, same seat, same posture, hands folded, eyes half-lidded. But no one in this room would ever mistake that posture for boredom again. They knew what it was now. They had seen it in action. It was a predator at rest, a mind that never stopped watching, never stopped calculating, never stopped assuming that somewhere in the shadows something was watching back. I believe I owe you an apology, Commander, Quellis said, and his voice was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with volume. I assumed you were here to learn. Lena smiled, and it was a tired smile, the kind that reached her eyes in a way that her polite diplomatic smiles never had. I was here to learn, Arch-Instructor, she said, just not what you were teaching. Kael leaned forward in his seat, his golden eyes sharp despite his exhaustion. What were you learning? He asked. Lena looked around the room, at the Varanthi, and the Duchon, and the Ilwari, and all the others. Started this fellowship, thinking they had nothing to learn from a young species, and who had ended it fighting beside one. Whether you were worth fighting beside, she said. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Kael Vorath, fierce, proud, predatory Kael, who came from a species that had been waging war since before humanity had learned to walk upright, leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound that shook the furniture and startled the Varanthi, and made Soreth's skin flash a dozen colors at once. And one by one, the others joined him, Varanthi clicking in their strange staccato rhythm, Ilwari flushing bright warm gold, Duchon rumbling and hissing, a dozen species laughing together in a room where they had once sat in proud separate silence. The Galactic Concord would fight the Scythari Dominion for another 3 years. It would be bloody and costly, and it would change the shape of civilization forever. But historians would later agree that the war was not won in the final battle or the decisive engagement. It was won in a classroom, on the day a species that had only been among the stars for a single generation taught the galaxy's oldest civilizations the most human lesson of all. It is not paranoia if they really are out to get you. And somewhere in a secure facility, deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a building that did not appear on any map, a filing cabinet held a folder stamped with a classification level that most humans did not know existed. Inside was a single page, a mission summary for an operation designated Open Book. Objective: strategic integration of Terran intelligence doctrine into Concord military culture. Method: 1 officer, 1 classroom, no weapons. Status: complete. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in neat, precise letters, was a note from the Director of Naval Intelligence herself. She did not fire a single shot. She did not raise her voice. She walked into a room full of the most powerful species in the galaxy, and she made them afraid of what they did not know. And then she made them brave enough to face it. This is what humans do. This is what we have always done. We do not conquer the darkness. We teach others to carry the light. Recommend Commander Vasquez for the Silver Star, and for the love of God, give the woman a raise. They asked why she was not taking notes. She said, because you are teaching my intelligence reports. They should have asked a better question. They should have asked what else she knew.